Because the God who loves us more than we can possibly ask or imagine said, you get the seat at my table, even if you're still crippled in both feet. Welcome back to the NIV Application Bible Podcast. Man, I have loved going on this tour through redemptive narrative with y'all. Thank you so much for joining us. We love hanging out with y'all. Well, I was just about to read a passage from 2 Samuel. Let me stop and tell you a story. When I was a little kid, I've already told y'all there's some hard stuff in my backstory. And one of the difficult things for me as a kid was I had to wear braces from my waist all the way down to my feet. If you've seen the movie Forrest Gump, you know, those big metal braces he had to wear. I wore those from the time I was 4 years old until the time I was 6. And it was hard to walk in them. And I didn't look like any of the other kids in school. I had to get out of class a little bit early because it took me so long to walk to the next class. I creaked. You could hear the metal squeaking. And I was a tomboy. I just wanted to run, but I couldn't run with those big, heavy metal braces on. My legs were growing crooked. And so the doctor told my mom, the orthopedist told my mom, if I didn't wear those full metal leg braces, I'd never be able to walk again. I'd be in a wheelchair by the time I was in high school. And so for 2 years, I wore those braces, and they made me look as crippled on the outside as I felt on the inside, because by then I had been a victim of some abuse that really made me feel crooked. And so there's this story in the Old Testament that I've always identified with. Bugs the fire out of me when people say the Bible is boring. It's the antithesis of boring. This is just packed full of stories about real people with real problems, people who felt crooked and crippled, and God restored them. This particular story, it's in 2 Samuel chapter 9. David, by now, he's the second king of Israel on the throne. And David asked, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? You remember David and Jonathan were BFFs when they were young boys, and they were just as close as brothers. But Jonathan's dad, the first king of Israel, Saul, hated David. He was a narcissistic nutter, and he hated David because David had become a folk hero by killing Goliath, and Saul was really jealous. And so early on in their friendship, when they were still teenagers, likely, Jonathan told David, if my dad is ever trying to kill you, I'll try to warn you first so you can escape with your life. And they made a vow to each other earlier on in 2 Samuel. They made a vow to each other that they would always have each other's back. Well, now decades have passed. Jonathan was killed in a battle with his dad, King Saul. David has become the second king of Israel. It's been decades since he's actually seen his friend who's now deceased face to face, but he remembers, I made a promise to Jonathan. I told Jonathan I would always have his back. I would even take care of his family. So he says, is there anyone still left in Saul's lineage that I can honor? And one of David's servants says, yes. He says, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet. Where is he? The king asked. This is in verse 4, 2 Samuel chapter 9. Ziba, that's the servant, answered, he is at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lo-debar. Lo-debar means barren place. So just imagine, if you will, there's this little boy, his name is Mephibosheth. When Jonathan and Saul are killed in battle, they assume that David is going to come rushing into Jerusalem and he's going to kill all of Saul's descendants, because that was common in this era. Kings who were coming into power would oftentimes kill all the descendants of the previous king. That way they could establish what they thought was a kingdom where there'd be no potential coup. Of course, David had no intention of doing that, but Saul's relatives didn't know that. And so on the way out of town, a nanny dropped this 4-year-old little boy, Saul's grandson, Jonathan's son. His name is Mephibosheth. I call him Bo. It's easier to pronounce. And he was crippled in both feet when he was dropped. So years later, this servant says, oh yeah, There's a descendant left. His name is Mephibosheth, and he lives in a barren place. And David says, go get him. So the servant goes to get Mephibosheth. Can you imagine? Let's just say he's 30 years old by now. He's living in a barren place. He's sitting in a lazy boy, duct tape on the arms. He's watching QVC, and all of a sudden there's a knock at the door, and there's an emissary from King David. What would you think? My guess is both thought, the jig is up. The king has found me. He's summoning me back to Jerusalem, and I'm going to get punished, possibly killed, because my grandfather Saul was a nutter who tried to kill this man David, who's now the king. And so he comes back to Jerusalem, and it says in verse 8, Mephibosheth bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? You can see his fear. You can see his insecurity. What in the world are you going to do to me, David? I'm just a dog. Listen to the king's response. This is just stunning. Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, I've given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table. That wasn't just about food. That was about family. Back then, if you ate at someone's table, it was metaphor for you were part of the family. And the chapter ends like this. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table, and he was lame in both feet. In other words, he didn't get fixed. He was still lame, and yet he was there in the favored seat of the king's table as a son of David. Y'all, this is all about the mercy of God. Here's how the application reads. I love this application note. We may be tempted to show kindness and to keep our covenant commitments only when it is convenient to do so, or when it shows particular promise of return in the workplace, in schools, even in church. We tend to keep our promises to those who will repay us in some way. In this text, David serves as an example because he keeps covenant and shows mercy to someone who cannot benefit him. Bo was still lame in both feet. And David said, I'll treat you like a son. You will always sit at my table. Don't think the Old Testament is about an angry God. You see the mercy of God always pointing to Jesus in the Old Testament. That is the gospel right there, y'all, in historical story form. You've got a guy who brought nothing to the table. He was lame in both feet. There was no ROI, no return on David's investment. And David said, go get him. I want to show him mercy because that's the promise I made to him. We have a promise-keeping God. Perfection is not a prerequisite for grace. Our God loves cripples. I remember the day I got those braces off. I was in the first grade. And I went out to play kickball. And for 2 years, I was never picked to be on the kickball team unless it was last. It was the first time. First time I actually walked up to home plate, and I can still remember Charlene Stallworth, great girl, first grade. She was the pitcher for the other team, and she rolled that ball toward me. Remember those big red rubber balls? She rolled the ball toward me, and the whole outfield had moved in because I was the girl with the leg braces. I was the cripple of the first grade. Nobody thought I could kick. And I remember that ball. It just seemed to get bigger and bigger and bigger as it rolled toward home plate. And I kicked that ball with all my might, and it went over everybody's head and I actually almost ran over the runner in front of me. I ran so fast I felt like I could fly. Came all the way in, scored at home. The whole team cheered. I remember the feeling that day of I'm free, I'm free, I'm free. I can finally run fast. Y'all, that is just the tiniest bit of what it feels like to be free from the guilt of shame, to have no condemnation, because the God who loves us more than we can possibly ask or imagine said, you get the seat at my table, even if you're still crippled in both feet. Don't think it's all about your behavior. This is not primarily a book about ethics. This isn't a rule book. It's not a textbook. It's not a collection of divine morality tales. This is a love story. about a perfect, holy, compassionate God who condescends to envelop cripples like us.